If you had told me 12 years ago that my future would play out on a stage in New York City, I probably would have laughed in your face. At that time, I was Kaya Nordstrom, an unremarkable software engineer renting a one-bedroom apartment with peeling paint on the north side of Seattle, fueled by cheap coffee and ambition. I believed, with the kind of naive certainty you only get in your 20s, that hard work and original thinking would always win in the end. I believed that technology was a meritocracy, a field where brilliance would always outshine bravado, and where true innovation was impossible to ignore. I could not have been more wrong. When I joined Technova Solutions in 2013, the company was just a mid-sized blip on the radar of the Pacific Northwest tech scene. I still remember the nervous energy of my first day, clutching my battered laptop as I walked into a glass and steel office, just a few blocks from Pike Place Market. The sun was shining and the city felt alive with possibility. Technova's mission, posted in glossy letters above the receptionist's desk, promised unleashing tomorrow. Today, I remember feeling electrified by those words. I wanted to be a part of something revolutionary. From the beginning, I poured everything into my work. I lived and breathed code, and in those early months, I would often lose track of time, hunched over my desk until sunrise, debugging a stubborn function or sketching out new architectures on a whiteboard in the deserted conference room. I loved the feeling of watching an algorithm come alive, the delicate interplay of logic and creativity. My ideas came quickly, sometimes in a flood, sometimes in the quiet after midnight when the city was asleep and the only sounds were the humming of servers and the soft click of keys. Technova quickly became my world. It was not just the office, but the community, my colleagues, the group lunches at that little bakery in Capitol Hill, and the happy hour meetups where we would debate the merits of various programming languages or the latest product launch from Silicon Valley. We were, for a time, a real team. At least, that's how it felt. Victor Tmain, our CEO, was the gravitational force around which everything seemed to orbit. He was tall, always impeccably dressed, with that kind of easy charm that made people want to be near him. Victor had a way of making you feel seen, even if just for a moment. He learned people's names quickly, remembered birthdays, and knew how to say just the right thing to win over clients and journalists alike. His office, on the top floor, was filled with awards and magazine covers, most of them featuring his chiseled jaw and confident smile. I'll admit, at first, I was drawn in by his energy and his vision for the company. But what I didn't realize then was how quickly my vision would be hijacked. Victor had an instinct, almost a sixth sense, for spotting talent. He also had a knack for taking credit for other people's work and making it look effortless. It started subtly. I would finish a complex project, maybe a new recommendation engine for an e-commerce client or an algorithm that made our supply chain prediction model twice as efficient. Victor would send a gracious email, ceasing the whole company. Incredible work, Kaya. We couldn't have done it without your dedication. Then, 2 days later, I'd see him on CNBC, explaining his breakthrough approach and outlining our collective vision. The interviewer would ask about the innovation and Victor would smile, humble but confident, as if the spark of inspiration had always been his. I tried not to let it bother me at first. I told myself it was part of the game, that eventually my contributions would shine through. My team knew the truth, and in the beginning, that was enough. I kept my head down, collecting a few raises and the occasional performance bonus. My bank account grew steadily, but it always felt temporary, as if I was saving up for an escape I had not yet planned. I rarely spent money on anything extravagant. Instead, I built a little nest egg, almost $320,000 saved in various accounts over the years, partly out of caution and partly because I wanted to be able to walk away when the time came. As time went on, the pattern repeated. The company grew. We moved from our modest Seattle office to a sleek high-rise in downtown with open floor plans and floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over Elliott Bay. I became lead architect, then head of data science, though those titles did not seem to matter much outside the internal directory. Victor became the public face of Technova, gracing the covers of Forbes and Wired, accepting awards at tech galas in New York and Los Angeles, always surrounded by reporters and investors. He liked to tell the story of our scrappy team, and how collaboration was at the heart of every breakthrough. He never mentioned my name. I began to see the truth, little by little. At first, it was just an offhand comment at a board meeting, Victor describing the new adaptive learning engine as my vision, while I sat silently in the back of the room, my notebook full of sketches and equations. Then it was a major industry award, a gold plaque with Victor's name etched into it. For the project I had spent 18 months building from scratch. Each time it happened, I felt a mixture of anger and shame. Anger at the theft. Shame that I let it continue. The worst part, I think, was the isolation. People began to see me not as an innovator but as Victor's engineer. Investors and clients would approach him at networking events, ask questions about the work I had done, and accept his answers as gospel, never once looking in my direction. I felt myself shrinking, becoming invisible, even as my influence on the company's success grew. There were times I considered leaving. I would look up job listings in Boston, Austin, or even London, imagining myself starting over at some scrappy startup or joining a research lab where my ideas would be valued. But each time, something held me back. Part of it was fear of the unknown, fear of losing the community I had helped build, fear of starting again in a world that felt so much bigger and colder than I remembered. And part of it was hope that Victor would change, that the company would recognize my contributions, that I would finally be given the credit I deserved. Those hopes were never realized. Instead, I found myself trapped in a kind of professional limbo, haunted by the knowledge that my best work was out in the world, attributed to someone else. I remember one evening in particular, a product launch party at a rooftop bar overlooking Puget Sound. The city lights sparkled below, and Victor was holding court at the center of a group of executives from London, telling a story about how he invented our automated fraud detection system. I stood a few feet away, holding a glass of bad champagne, listening to him twist the facts. I felt like a ghost at my funeral. As the years went by, Victor's grip on the company only tightened. He cultivated an inner circle of loyalists, people who owed their promotions and bonuses to him, not to the actual results of their work. He began to reward those who flattered him most, sidelining anyone who asked too many questions or challenged his authority. The culture at Teknova changed. The open collaboration that had once defined our team was replaced by suspicion and competition. People stopped sharing ideas freely, afraid their work would be co-opted or their ambitions used against them. For a while, I tried to adapt. I became more guarded, less trusting, and careful about what I shared and with whom. I still gave everything I had to my projects, but the joy had faded. I found myself working late into the night, not out of passion, but out of a stubborn refusal to give Victor any excuse to undermine me. I started keeping detailed records, notes, emails, drafts, even voice memos, quietly documenting my authorship in case I ever needed to prove it. Despite everything, I stayed. I told myself that things would change. I wanted to believe that the world was just, that hard work and honesty still mattered, that one day someone would see me. I kept hoping for a breakthrough, a moment when the truth would finally come out. But the moment that changed everything came not with a revelation, but with a laugh. It was a Monday morning, the kind that begins with the sickly buzz of fluorescent lights and a calendar full of back-to-back meetings. The conference room was packed, half the engineering team, a few board members from New York, and Victor himself at the head of the table, looking sleek in a charcoal suit. We were presenting a new system, one that would become the backbone of Teknova's next product line. I had led the project, spent months refining every detail. Yet Victor had introduced the work as if it were a minor upgrade. As I spoke, outlining the most complex elements of the design, Victor interrupted me with a joke about old-school engineers, and how some of us have been around long enough to remember the days of punch cards. The room erupted in laughter. Victor grinned at me, his eyes cold. "Kaya, how long have you been at this? Maybe it's time to let some younger talent take the lead." I laughed along with everyone else. But inside, something snapped. For years, I had convinced myself that I needed Teknova, that I needed Victor's approval, that my worth was measured by how much I could endure. But in that moment, I realized the only person I needed to believe in me was myself. I looked around the room and saw not friends or colleagues, but a sea of strangers, none of whom would ever fight for me. That was the day everything changed. That was the day I stopped being invisible. The moment I walked out of that meeting, I knew I would never again let someone else write my story. Looking back, I realized that my trust in people, especially in professional circles, had always been tainted with a wary undercurrent. Maybe it was growing up in a family where secrets felt as natural as breathing. Or perhaps it was just the instincts I sharpened over years of quietly watching who got credit and who got left behind. Either way, long before that final humiliating meeting, I had learned the importance of documenting everything. Some called it paranoia, but I liked to think of it as self-preservation. I started small. At first, it was just about keeping track of my ideas. Early in my tenure at Teknova Solutions, I would jot down my thoughts in a battered old Moleskine notebook that lived in my backpack. Sketches of system diagrams, rough notes about data pipelines, scribbled to-do lists with stars next to the items I thought might spark something big. I still have those notebooks stacked in my closet in Seattle, silent witnesses to nights when I chased a solution until dawn. The habit became something deeper as I watched Victor work his magic, twisting stories in boardrooms, repackaging other people's breakthroughs as his own. The pattern was too obvious to ignore. I needed to protect myself. It began as a simple digital backup, every line of code I wrote, every technical document, and each draft of a white paper. I copied and sent to a private cloud account that I managed myself. Not Technova's corporate storage, not any system Victor or his trusted IT people had access to, but a subscription I paid for based out of a data center in Chicago. I created folders labeled with obscure project nicknames, sometimes just strings of numbers and letters that only I understood. As the years went by, my secret archive grew. There were gigabytes of source code, raw data, simulation results, design diagrams, performance benchmarks, and all of it was time-stamped, meticulously organized, and cryptographically hashed so I could always prove the files were unaltered. After every big milestone, I would document the process in even more detail. I wrote technical summaries explaining why each design decision was made, outlining the problems I solved and how. For every project that moved the needle for Technova, I had a private counterpart, a kind of parallel universe where my authorship was clear, undisputed, and safe from Victor's reach. This careful documentation extended to email. If I came up with a breakthrough or figured out a critical bug fix, I would summarize it and send the explanation to my email account or sometimes to a trusted friend outside of the company. Sometimes I even scheduled emails to myself, set to deliver months later, so that the timestamp would forever record the fact that the work was mine and mine alone. I did all this quietly, without fanfare, and I told no one. Paranoia, maybe, but it was also the first act of self-respect I had practiced in years. I realize now that all those records, those hidden breadcrumbs of proof, became my security blanket. When things were rough at Technova, when Victor's latest round of public praise excluded me, or when the board sent congratulatory bonuses straight to his account, I would open my files at home. I would flip through technical papers stamped with my name and the dates of invention, remembering who I was beneath the layers of silence Technova draped over me. By the end, I had thousands of lines of code, dozens of technical presentations, and more than 30 white papers, all chronicling my contributions to Technova's most lucrative products. I sometimes imagined what would happen if the truth ever came to light. But even then, a part of me doubted it would ever matter. Victor's reach was long. His confidence was contagious. He had built a fortress out of charisma, connections, and smoke and mirrors. I felt trapped on the outside, a ghost in the machine I had helped build. The moment finally came when I realized that simply surviving wasn't enough anymore. After Victor's public humiliation at that meeting when he laughed about my age, my value, and my role at Technova, I went home and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time. I stared at the boxes I had never fully unpacked, the books I hadn't read, the plants that wilted on the windowsill. My whole life in Seattle had been built around work. Without that, what was left? The truth is, I was terrified. But somewhere beneath the fear, I felt the slow, powerful rise of something new. I was angry, yes, but I was also ready. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I opened my laptop and began drafting my resignation letter. I wrote and rewrote it a dozen times. I wanted to sound professional, even gracious, but I also needed to make it clear that I would not quietly disappear. When the letter was finished, I attached a 2-page document for the legal team at Technova. In it, I laid out my case, a detailed account of my authorship for key products, complete with file paths, cryptographic hashes, and a timeline of my involvement supported by emails, drafts, and cloud backup receipts. I also attached a personal letter to Victor, short and to the point, letting him know that the era of stolen credit was over. It felt both terrifying and exhilarating to finally hit send. The next morning, Victor's response came through like clockwork. He didn't even try to hide his condescension. He called me into his office, that sun-drenched glass box at the top of the building, and told me in front of 2 board members that he respected my choice and wished me well. Then, with a smirk, he turned to the board and joked that I was probably just moving on to spend more time with my cats. The room chuckled politely, as if this was the natural order of things, brilliant women stepping aside so the Victor Tmains of the world could keep center stage. But I saw something different in his eyes that day. Maybe it was a flicker of uncertainty, or maybe just the calculation of a man who had relied on other people's work for too long. I left the office without saying goodbye to anyone. I didn't pack up my desk, didn't take my nameplate or the coffee mug with the faded blue star. I just walked out, my bag slung over my shoulder and my resignation email already echoing through the system. I went home to my small house in Green Lake, sat on my porch, and waited for the fallout. It was the first time in years I felt entirely alone with my thoughts. I thought about the future, about what would happen next, about whether anyone would believe me. The world outside seemed impossibly wide, but for the first time, I did not feel small. The call from Technova's legal department came less than 48 hours later. The tone was polite but wary. They wanted to discuss intellectual property concerns. I could almost hear the gears turning on the other end of the line, the realization that the company's golden goose might have been building a nest elsewhere this whole time. I arranged for a video meeting and presented my files calmly, factually, letting the evidence speak for itself. I watched their faces as the timeline came together, watched as they realized the depth of my documentation, how every claim Victor had made about his authorship was easily disproven. The fallout came faster than I expected. Technova's legal team tried to negotiate, offered a severance package in exchange for my silence. But I declined. I did not want hush money. I wanted respect. I wanted my name back. Within 2 days, my phone rang again. This time it was Dr. Carmen Vasquez, Chief Technology Officer at Quantum Dynamics. I had heard her speak at a conference in Boston years ago, a brilliant mind, sharp and unafraid to speak her truth. She congratulated me on my courage, told me she had followed my work for years, and offered me the role of CTO at her company. The offer came with a starting salary of $520,000 and an executive suite in a historic brick building overlooking Boston Harbor. It almost didn't feel real. The decision to accept was not easy. Seattle had been my home for over a decade. My friends, the city's rain-soaked streets, even the old house I rented, all these things had become part of my identity. But I knew that staying would mean more of the same, more invisible labor, more stolen credit, more years spent hiding my brilliance for the sake of someone else's ego. I packed my bags and booked a one-way ticket to Boston. As the plane soared over the Midwest, I watched the lights below blur into rivers of gold and silver, and for the first time in years, I felt weightless. I thought about Victor, about the empire he had built on borrowed light, and wondered how long it would take for the world to notice the difference. I remembered all the money he had hoarded, the stock options and bonuses and perks, and I realized that none of it could buy what I felt in that moment. Freedom. When I arrived in Boston, Dr. Vasquez greeted me in her office with a smile and a firm handshake. She introduced me to the team, and I felt an energy in the room that I had not felt in years, an excitement for ideas, for risk, for possibility. They were building something new, and they wanted me at the heart of it. My past at Technova became a footnote, something people whispered about in industry circles, but never defined me. For the first time, my work and my name were inseparable. Sometimes, late at night, I would still open my old files, the proof, the evidence, the history. Not because I was afraid anymore, but because I wanted to remember how far I had come. The records I kept were no longer just a shield. They had become the foundation of the new life I was finally ready to build. 6 months passed like a whirlwind after I landed in Boston. Quantum Dynamics turned out to be everything Technova wasn't: driven, collaborative, and electric with fresh ambition. Drive Vasquez welcomed me as a peer, not a subordinate. My first weeks as CTO were filled with open dialogue, brainstorming sessions in sunlit rooms overlooking Boston Harbor, and a sense of belonging I had never known before. My new team, people like Matt Chen, our head of engineering, and Olivia Bennett, a sharp-witted systems analyst from Manchester, reminded me every day how exhilarating real partnership could be. It was late September when I got the invitation to speak at the North American Tech Leaders Conference in Manhattan. Even after everything, I still felt a flutter of nerves reading the formal email. The conference was the biggest annual gathering of the world's top minds in technology and finance. Companies sent their brightest to show off breakthroughs, court investors, and scout talent. It was where trends were set, careers made or broken, and for years, I had watched Technova's booth from a distance as Victor dazzled crowds with projects I had built in the shadows. Now, for the first time, I was going as myself, Kaya Nordstrom, CTO of Quantum Dynamics. The title alone felt surreal. Dr. Vasquez met me in my office the morning we were due to leave. "You're going to knock them dead, Kaya," she said, her voice both reassuring and excited. "And this time, the world is going to see who did the work." The conference was being held in the glass and steel marvel that was the Hudson Expo Center, not far from the High Line. My hotel room overlooked the city skyline, a living mosaic of light and energy. I stood by the window my first night, watching the taxis and crowds below, and felt the magnitude of what was ahead. It was not just a chance to share our work, but a moment of truth, one that would test how much I had left my old life behind. On the morning of my keynote, I woke at dawn, unable to sleep. The city was already awake, horns blaring, voices echoing through the concrete canyons. I made myself a cup of coffee and went over my slides again and again, practicing my words in the mirror. For years, my work had spoken for me. Now, I had to step forward and let my voice fill the room. The Expo Center was alive with anticipation. Halls filled with attendees from all over the United States, Canada, Germany, France, and the UK. The registration desk bustled with people in sharp suits and branded lanyards, while banners for Quantum Dynamics and Technova Solutions competed for space along the mezzanine. I saw faces I recognized, engineers I'd admired from afar, industry journalists, and venture capitalists whose checkbooks could change the fate of a company in a single meeting. I could not help but scan the crowd for Victor. I spotted him at the Technova Solutions booth, a small circle of admirers orbiting his expensive shoes and easy smile. He had aged since I last saw him, his hair thinner, his eyes darting with a nervousness I had never seen before. When our eyes met for the briefest moment, he nodded, a smirk ghosting across his face. I smiled back, steady and unflinching. The keynote stage was massive, high ceilings, glowing screens, and rows of seats stretching into the shadows. Dr. Vasquez went first, introducing quantum dynamics and laying out the vision for our next-generation AI platform. When she called me up, my hands trembled slightly. But I reminded myself of all the nights I had worked for this. I took a breath and stepped into the light. It's strange how quickly you can find your footing when you finally have permission to be seen. I spoke about our new adaptive learning algorithm, how it could reconfigure itself in real time to serve clients in logistics, finance, and healthcare. I explained the architecture, the problem it solved, and the way we designed it to be transparent, auditable, and fair. The audience leaned in, scribbling notes and snapping photos of my diagrams. As I finished my talk, hands shot up. One after another, people asked technical questions. How did the model avoid bias? How did we handle data drift? What about adversarial inputs? I answered each question in detail, drawing on the years of work I had poured into the field. It felt almost effortless, a dance of knowledge and intuition that I had rehearsed 1,000 times in private. The applause at the end was thunderous, echoing through the hall long after I stepped down. Afterward, Dr. Vasquez pulled me aside, her eyes shining. "You did it, Kaya," she whispered. "You showed them exactly who you are." It felt like coming up for air after years underwater. The real drama came later that afternoon. When Victor took the stage, he was listed as Chief Visionary Officer of Technova Solutions, a title as vague as his presentation. His slides looked familiar, the same diagrams I had drawn, the same buzzwords I had once used to sell the promise of our early prototypes. He began confidently, weaving a tale of innovation and leadership. But as the questions started, it was clear something was wrong. A professor from MIT asked Victor to explain how Technova's model handled real-time data ingestion. Victor blinked, repeated a line from his slides, and moved on. A software architect from Berlin pressed him on the specifics of the model's auditing mechanism. Victor gave a vague answer, clearly stalling for time. The crowd sensed his discomfort. More hands went up, each question more pointed than the last. As Victor stumbled through his responses, it became painfully clear that he did not understand the underlying technology. The turning point came when Dr. Vasquez, sitting in the front row, stood up and asked her a question. "Mr. Tmain, could you walk us through the decision process for selecting the recursive optimization protocol you mentioned? And could you clarify how it avoids feedback loop contamination in high-frequency environments?" Victor froze. For a few seconds, the only sound was the hum of the projector. He looked at the slides, then at the audience, and stammered something about team-based decisions and proprietary processes. The room went silent. That was when Dr. Vasquez turned to me and, microphone in hand, said, "I'd like to recognize the true architect behind this breakthrough, Kaya Nordstrom. Would you care to answer the question?" A hush fell over the auditorium. Hundreds of faces turned toward me, some surprised, some expectant. I felt every muscle in my body tighten, but I walked to the front of the room, took the microphone, and began to speak. I explained the decision process in detail, how we used real-time simulations to test recursive optimization, the way we implemented guardrails to avoid feedback loop contamination, and the trade-offs we considered in selecting protocols that balance speed and accuracy. I outlined the experiments, the failures, and the breakthroughs that had led us here. I made sure to give credit to the teams who had supported me, Matt, Olivia, and the entire engineering group. At Quantum Dynamics, for the first time in my career, I felt like the woman behind the curtain had finally stepped out onto the stage. The applause was overwhelming, echoing through the hall as people stood to clap. I could see faces in the crowd, engineers who had struggled for recognition, women and men who knew what it felt like to be overlooked. In that moment, the years of invisibility and stolen credit seemed to dissolve. I was seen. For the rest of the conference, the tide shifted. Reporters approached me for interviews, CEOs invited me to private dinners, and young developers stopped me in the hall to ask about my journey. Technova Solutions' booth was quiet, its executives keeping a low profile. Within days, news of Victor's humiliation spread through the industry. Technova's share price dropped 15% as investors questioned the company's leadership and future. Later that evening, back in my hotel room, I opened my laptop to a flood of messages, congratulations from friends old and new, invitations to collaborate, and notes from people who had followed my work in silence for years. I called my mother in Minnesota, who cried when she heard the news. "I always knew you'd have your day, Kaya," she said. "It's about time the world caught up." The next morning, at the closing session, Dr. Vasquez made it official. Standing at the podium, she thanked the conference organizers, then turned to the audience. "We are only as strong as the people who make innovation possible," she said. "Today, I want to recognize Kaya Nordstrom, whose work is changing the future of technology in America and beyond." As the applause swelled once more, I felt something deep inside me finally settle. I was no longer just the ghost in the machine. I was the mind and the name behind the code. And this time, no one could take that from me. In the months that followed the conference in Manhattan, I found myself living in a world that felt both familiar and utterly transformed. The weight that had followed me for more than a decade seemed to slip away piece by piece as I stepped more fully into my new role at Quantum Dynamics. Cambridge, Massachusetts became my new home, a city that buzzed with academic energy and innovation. Its old brick buildings standing in contrast to the sleek offices of tech companies, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Every morning, I walked to work past Harvard Square, the air crisp with possibility. I settled into a brownstone just off Brattle Street with a sunlit corner office that looked out onto a patchwork of sycamore trees and bustling students. I filled my shelves with the technical books I'd carried across the country and tacked up whiteboards in the living room, a habit I'd never quite managed to break. The house slowly filled with friends engineers from Quantum Dynamics, visiting researchers from it. Even a few old colleagues from Seattle who were curious about the new life I was building. It became a kind of sanctuary. A place where ideas were traded freely and laughter echoed through the rooms late into the night. Quantum Dynamics thrived in a way that felt almost effortless. Dr. Vasquez and I worked side by side, our energies complementing each other. We built teams that valued transparency and innovation over ego, and together we shipped products that changed the way hospitals managed patient data and how supply chains across America adapted in real time. My salary climbed to $680,000 a year, more than I had ever dreamed possible, but the real currency was respect, the kind that came not from applause or bonuses but from honest conversations and shared breakthroughs. The biggest shift, though, was internal. After years of living in Victor's shadow, I found my voice. I became a mentor to women and men who were just starting, sharing my story openly and encouraging them to keep their records, to advocate for their contributions, and to never let anyone else define the limits of their talent. I spoke at universities in Boston and New York, sometimes flying to conferences in San Francisco or even London. I received invitations from Zurich and Paris, cities I had only ever dreamed of visiting, but I turned most of them down, wanting to put down roots, to build something lasting in this new chapter of my life. In the quiet moments walking along the Charles River in the early morning or curled up with a book in my sunlit living room, I sometimes thought about Seattle and Victor. The city that had once felt so much like home now seemed like a distant memory, a lesson learned rather than a life lost. I heard from old colleagues that Technova Solutions was struggling. Investors pulled their funding, major clients walked away, and Victor's name disappeared from the lists of most innovative leaders and top CEOs to watch. It was all over the news for a few weeks, then faded away as the tech world moved on to its next sensation. Sometimes I felt a twinge of sadness, but mostly I felt relief. I had let go of the anger. I had moved on. One chilly morning in early spring, I was making coffee when I noticed a thick envelope in my mailbox, handwritten and unfamiliar. There was no return address, just my name, carefully inked on the front. I brought it inside, feeling a prickle of curiosity. Something about the handwriting was hesitant, almost apologetic. I opened the envelope and found several pages of heavy cream-colored paper. The words sprawling and uncertain. It took me a moment to realize it was from Victor. He began with a kind of stumbling honesty that I had never seen from him before. He wrote about the years at Technova, how he had built his success on the energy and ideas of others. He admitted, line by line, to what I had always known, how he had taken my work, dressed it up in his language and presented it to the world as his. He described the pressure he had felt to always have the answers, to always be the smartest person in the room, and how that fear had driven him to deception. He wrote of the moment at the conference in Manhattan when the questions had come, and he had been unable to answer them. He described standing on that stage, feeling the eyes of hundreds of peers and rivals, and knowing with a cold certainty that the illusion had finally broken. He said that the silence after Dr. Vasquez's question was the longest moment of his life. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not make excuses for what he had done. Instead, he wrote about the courage it took to walk away and how seeing me finally receive the recognition I deserved had made him realize what he had lost, not just a company or a reputation, but a chance to be honest, to be better. He ended the letter by calling me brilliant for the first time without reservation. Your mind, he wrote, was the heartbeat of everything we built. You deserved better. I see that now, and I am sorry. He signed his name, simply Victor. I sat with the letter in my lap for a long time, reading the words over and over. I expected to feel satisfaction, or even triumph, but instead I felt something softer, something like closure. For years, I had been running from his shadow, trying to prove myself in the face of doubt and theft. Now, I realized I no longer needed anything from him. Not validation, not praise, not even an apology. The truth had finally found its way into the open, and with it, a sense of peace I had never known before. Later that evening, as the light faded over the Charles, I wrote back to him not to reopen old wounds, but to acknowledge the simple fact that our stories were finally untangled. I told him that I wished him well, that I hoped he would find his way forward, and that I hoped he would never again silence the voices of those who worked alongside him. I didn't need to say more. My life, at last, was my own. Spring in Cambridge brought a renewal that matched my mood. The city burst into color, cherry blossoms lining the streets, new grass pushing up between the bricks, and the river sparkling in the morning sun. My days were filled with new projects, new friendships, and a sense of possibility that seemed boundless. Dr. Vasquez and I began work on a new initiative, partnering with universities across the US and Europe to encourage diversity in tech, to mentor students from backgrounds that were too often overlooked. My story became a rallying point, a living example that quiet persistence and fierce self-respect could rewrite even the oldest narratives. One evening, after a long day of meetings and code reviews, I hosted a small gathering at my house. Olivia brought a chocolate cake from a bakery in Beacon Hill, and Matt played old jazz records in the living room. As the night deepened and the conversation turned to what it meant to create something lasting, I looked around at the faces glowing in the candlelight. I thought about how far I had come from those lonely nights in Seattle, scribbling ideas in a notebook, wondering if anyone would ever really see me. Here, in this room, I felt not just seen but understood. I realized that the recognition I had sought all those years was only meaningful because I had earned it honestly, surrounded by people who valued the truth. There are still days when doubts creep in, moments when I question whether I am enough, whether the world will ever fully see the people who work in the margins. But each time, I remind myself of what I have learned, that your worth is not determined by the credit others give you, but by the quiet courage it takes to claim your own story. Recognition is sweet, but dignity is sweeter. Sometimes I think about the letter from Victor, now tucked in a drawer with my old Moleskine notebooks, and the first offer letter from Quantum Dynamics. I keep it not as a reminder of what was taken, but as proof of what can be reclaimed. For years, I thought my story would always be about betrayal and disappointment. But now I know it is about possibility, about beginning again, about the freedom to create, to inspire, and to lead, not in someone else's shadow, but in the full light of my own making. To anyone who might read this someday, who feels lost or overlooked, who has ever had their voice drowned out by louder, less honest ones, I want to say, never wait for permission to shine. If your moment comes, step forward, even if your voice shakes. Protect your work, trust your instincts, and surround yourself with those who see you. The world needs what only you can create. And when the recognition finally comes, whether it's a letter, a standing ovation, or simply a quiet moment of peace, let yourself receive it. You have earned it. You are enough. And that, I suppose, is how my story begins again, not in the shadows, but in the light, where it always belonged.